Good morning.
Good morning.
Good to see everyone.
So, you are counsel to Cynthia Lummis, U.S. Senator from Wyoming, and one of the first, really, if not the first, senator in the U.S. to take an extremely ardent pro-Bitcoin stance. But before we talk about Senate politics, I want to talk about the sort of substrate of D.C. policy that people often dismiss, which is the staff that really makes public policy happen. And I think your journey is very interesting. You know, you were at Stanford Law, you were in big law, and you got this incredible opportunity to take a hard pivot in your career. Can you just tell us a bit about who you are, what drew you to Bitcoin, and how you wound up on this stage?
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey. So I was at Stanford Law School in 2018 and sort of accidentally fell down the Bitcoin rabbit hole. And I became increasingly persuaded by the same arguments that Zach was just making, which is that when you just line up Bitcoin's monetary properties, the consequences that follow from that are sort of inevitable and play out in a very structured way that we've seen many times in monetary history, which is that the strongest money will win and will become the new reserve capital asset. So that convinced me, but I had already sort of lined up a job, as a corporate attorney and did that for a few years. But even when I was working as an attorney, I was still, outside of my 9 to 5 or 9 to 8, working on Bitcoin or thinking about Bitcoin or writing about Bitcoin or listening to Bitcoin podcast or, thinking about how this all plays out. And I was extremely fortunate to have the opportunity and sort of the right connection to get connected to Senator Lummis's team and work for her on Bitcoin and artificial intelligence policy. And, when that opportunity presented itself, I couldn't really say no. Wouldn't really work for anyone else, but she is a senator who truly understands Bitcoin at its depths, reads the same materials that I was reading, and I think has the same view towards the future of how important this technology will be. And so when that arose, I jumped at it.
Yeah, and so I think it's interesting what happens when you take a senator who truly understands Bitcoin and a staffer who truly understands Bitcoin. You get something interesting, and in this case, it was a bill calling for the establishment of a strategic Bitcoin reserve for the United States. This was an idea that, when it was first proposed in Nashville, was kind of written off as a headline, bait. And then with just extreme rapidity, we had an executive order from the president establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. For those unfamiliar with the concept, it's a bit intuitive, right? We use the United States to buy Bitcoin to safeguard our future. But people may get it, but they don't probably understand why that's a good idea. Why did you help write this bill? Why did Senator Lummis introduce this bill? What is the point of the United States purchasing Bitcoin?
Sure. So we see Bitcoin as a tool like many other tools that are at the state's disposal. And Senator Lummis, she comes from Wyoming, one of the only states to have a sovereign wealth fund. And she saw firsthand as Wyoming state treasurer the importance of diversifying that wealth fund into a wide variety of different assets and sort of the benefits that brings. So when we were thinking about the bill conceptually, we looked at all the different reserves that America has. We have, munitions reserves. We have gold reserves. We even have a strategic cheese reserve, surprisingly. So we thought, okay, well, Bitcoin added as a reserve is a no-brainer. Just like the U.S. makes many different investments in a wide variety of different tools, Bitcoin simply is the greatest savings technology. And because of those properties, it makes sense to hold it and use it as a savings tool, just like you would purchase computers to use as a communications tool.
And so let's dive into the policy a bit more. You have proposed that we purchase 200,000 Bitcoins per year over the course of 5 years, such that the U.S. winds up with 1 million Bitcoins. Why that number? Why in such size?
Size. I mean, really, we were trying to be conservative. When you think about 1 million Bitcoins, I mean, is that really that much in the grand scheme of things? We were looking at the history of gold and sort of doing some interesting like historical comparisons. And I mean, I think the historical parallel here is what did our gold reserve do and how did that sort of set us up in the 20th century, and how would we scope Bitcoin to be parallel to that? So we looked at the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. We looked at the consequences of that. Shocker to me, the Gold Reserve Act of 1934 basically put a standing bid in the market that allowed America to acquire 80% of all the world's gold. 80%. So we thought, okay, well, obviously we're not going to do 80% of the world's Bitcoin, but we could do 1 million coins. We could do 5%, right? And so, I mean, the historical parallels is that just by having the gold reserve as a global reserve capital asset allowed us to have the dollar as the world reserve currency, and that the capital and currency are these two sort of interconnected pieces that fit together quite nicely for international influence. So when we were thinking about the Bitcoin reserve, we see this as the next global reserve capital asset. And so it made sense that we would, essentially diversify what we have currently as just gold to gold plus Bitcoin through this bill.
I see. So I know that there is also a kind of deeper sort of strategic thinking that underpins this proposal, and it aligns with a lot of things we've been talking about at BPI for a long time. This idea that Bitcoin, by virtue of its sort of unique properties, its neutrality, its lack of a founder or a CEO or a team, even as crypto writ large takes up more mind share, our view has been for a long time that Bitcoin is not a subset of digital asset regulation or digital asset policy, but that we think that Bitcoin is going to kind of eclipse that niche, that Bitcoin will sort of be elevated to a much more lofty strategic topic that sort of touches every element of statecraft. That was a really wonky and bizarre idea, really until the president and the vice president both said the exact same thing about Bitcoin's sort of uniqueness and its relevance in a unique way to the national interest. From your perspective, are you seeing, any kind of, are you seeing that narrative start to emerge? Are you seeing Bitcoin starting to decouple from crypto as a policy issue into a more sort of one-of-one strategic conversation?
I do see that happening, and I think the realization, and this is happening across multiple fronts, of strategy is increasingly focused on these digital forms. So we're looking at artificial intelligence, but we're also looking at digital capital, and I think that is where Bitcoin really shines. And the reality is that economic security is intimately linked with national security. They're really one and the same. You can only project power if you have a strong economic base that can sustain that, and fiscal credibility. And that the importance of the Bitcoin reserve is to sort of have that economic security and that foundation and that fiscal credibility in a digital age. So what has been surprising to us is sort of how quickly this has been received. And, we've been speaking, I know Senator Lummis has referenced this before, but we have been speaking with sort of high-ranking military officials about the interconnection for military competitiveness is having that strong economic base and understanding Bitcoin as fitting into a 21st century strategy for great power competition.
Yeah, so we got a few minutes left. One thing I just feel like we have to address is like that. To be honest, Connor, that all sounds very reasonable, but I kind of thought the SBR was just a handout to crypto donors.
Yeah,
that's what it struck me as. I'm joking, but I do think that outside of some of these bubbles, that is certainly the way that the average person may look at this. Although
Sure.
there's recently research that's been published by some BPI fellows that suggests that actually the overwhelming majority of Americans support diversifying some of our gold into Bitcoin. It's a wildly popular idea, but I think in the popular media, the mainstream news, the kind of main hit has been, this has no strategic significance. This is just a quid pro quo. I'm sure you hear that objection a lot as you're advocating for this bill on the Hill. What is your response to the critics who say that?
Yeah, and to be honest, I mean, we've heard it from both sides. There's also the strong libertarian side of the conservative political spectrum that have said the same thing to me. But I think the reality is that, like, going back to our first principles understanding, Bitcoin is a tool that offers savings technology to individuals, corporations, states, pensions, nation states. It is a tool that every individual actor has to look at the properties and assess for themselves whether or not it is in their interest to adopt it. And we're seeing that across the spectrum, people are assessing this tool as beneficial for expanding their interest. And I think that the same logic applies at the nation state. And in fact, this is the exact opposite of a bailout. A bailout is we have made terrible decisions and we need free money from the money printer to solve those decisions for us and sort of socialize the losses. This is, if anything, a bailout for the American people that have been, just tossed with trillions and trillions of dollars of debt. And this seems like one of the only ways to actually right-size the boat in a way that's feasible. I mean, we're seeing how difficult reconciliation is right now, but the ability to position yourself strategically at the front of a monetary paradigm shift that will radically shift who is the holder of global reserve capital, being the first person on that and letting that game theory play out and being the person who benefits from that, the nation that benefits from that the most, is the best way to sort of, I think, right-size America's fiscal position in a way that doesn't result in massive austerity cuts or money printing galore. And so the Bitcoin is the third path that can solve that.
Well, I agree. And Connor, I just want to applaud you for all of the work that you do behind the scenes. Everyone knows your boss. Not enough people know you. And I think the Bitcoin community and the country both owe you a big debt. So thank you.
Thank you, David.